Hip extension is a movement that we all do. It's required when we walk, run. Anytime we bring our leg behind us, that's hip extension. But for many of us, we don't actually do hip extension as well as we could. We miss out on a lot of really important benefits that we can get from a good, well done hip extension. So this is a 3-part series that is going to share with you 3 different ways to hip extend and maximize the amount of movement benefits that we can get. I'm Bree Johnson, Heart and Bones Yoga, and if you love these tutorials, press that subscribe button. Okay, now let's get started. Voila, like magic, here is our little skeleton who has one leg, and it's going to be sufficient enough for us to see what hip extension is. Now, hip extension is any time that your femur bone, your thigh bone, moves behind you. Flexion is when you bring your leg in front of you like this. So anytime you're sitting, anytime you're running, you're in hip flexion. And this is a position that many of us spend way more time in than extension. So this is why we're doing this series on hip extension, so that we can get the benefits of reducing tension in the hip joints and also improving the mobility of your hip joints as well. So that's hip extension. But what we're going to focus on here is how to get hip extension without moving your pelvis. Because most people, many of the movements that we do, we end up bringing the pelvis here and your lumbar spine, your lower back here, along for the ride. We use the pelvis and the lumbar spine to help move the leg back. In some cases that's great, but in many cases that's just a postural default that we might not know that we even have. And now we're going to learn and understand how to move your leg without your pelvis. Now, many of the go-to movements that we do when we feel tension in the hips, when we want to do some hip extension, would be a lunge. And I love lunges. I think they're great and super valuable. And I also think that there's ways that we can do them a lot better. And that's what I'm going to show you right now. We're going to show you a couple variations on how to get that full breadth of movement in the hip joint so that, again, we can get that benefit for the hip extension. So the first thing we're going to do is come into a lunge. And in this lunge, you're going to take your right foot forward, left foot back. And first, it's helpful to be familiar with some of the bony landmarks on your body, which means you're going to take your hands onto your pelvis, and I invite you to find your hip points, your ASISs, and they're just right there at the front of your pelvis. See if you can find them. And then get a sense that they're pointing forward, that both sides of your pelvis are pointing forward, not one back, not down, not up, but what we like to call more of a neutral pelvis. So think about those ASISs, your 2 hip points, pointing forward like the headlights of a car. Now what we want to do, because we want to separate the movement from your pelvis and your thigh bone. So in this variation of this lunge, we will be moving the pelvis forward, keeping your leg as it is, which will create that hip extension. So we're going to create hip extension by moving the pelvis forward. And you can see when I'm doing this movement, I'm moving my pelvis forward, but I'm not going to let my pelvis, or those headlights of the car, if that's an image that works for you, to point downwards. Because the further we go into this lunge, the more your pelvis just naturally will point down. We start to go into a forward or anterior tilt of the pelvis. For this variation, we want to avoid that. So let's come back. Think about neutral pelvis, those headlights pointing forward, and you're only going to allow your pelvis to slide as far forward as you can until you feel that your pelvis wants to start to tilt down. You can do this in front of a mirror. That's also super helpful as well. So you can see for me how far I go. And I'm going to go to about there. So I didn't really travel all that far. This isn't what you would call, quote, deep lunge. This is as far as I can take my pelvis forward without letting it go into an anterior tilt. And so anatomically what that's doing is moving pelvis forward away from my thigh bone, creating that hip extension. So this is lovely. And if you're doing this with me, you're going to definitely feel some new good muscles here, areas of your hips waking up. Also keep in mind to have your ribs down, and then just find that sweet spot, find the edge, keep your pelvis in a neutral position, moving your pelvis forward away from your thigh. So that's variation number 1. Go ahead and do the other side if you'd like, but we're going to move forward to the next variations. So remember, this was pelvis moving away from the thigh. Now we're going to do thigh moving from the pelvis. Okay, so this next lunge that we're going to do, we will take our leg forward, and then we're going to come into what will look like a more traditional low lunge here. And this low lunge, my pelvis is absolutely in an anterior tilt. It has to be to get into this position, and that's just fine. Now the work that we're going to try to do is keep our pelvis where it is, and this time have your thigh bone, have your femur bone move behind you. How we're going to do, and it's naturally doing that anyways, but we're going to add on a little bit here. So you've got your hands on the ground, or maybe you have hands on blocks, and you're going to think about just letting your pelvis drop down. Feel it heavy, and then tuck your back toes underneath. And without letting your pelvis lift up, you're going to allow your knee to lift off the ground. I'll show this as a before and after. Real quick, you want to see, so if I just let my knee lift and my leg lift, all the way, my pelvis lifts up. Still a great variation, but not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is to keep your pelvis as it is, and then I'm just lifting my knee off the ground, which is pulling my thigh away from my body and away from my pelvis. So you'll see the difference. I highly recommend to do a before and after. Why not? Tuck your toes underneath, straighten up that leg. You feel a great stretch in this variation. But then to refine it and get into some of the deeper tissues in our hip joints, we keep the pelvis heavy and low. And you can see the difference here when I just lift up my leg. My pelvis doesn't go anywhere, but you can see my knee lifting off the ground and my leg stretching behind me. So this really gets us a lot more awake in the hips, as you're probably noticing along with me. So there you have it. Those are 2 variations on our lunge. Super simple, where think about moving your pelvis, keeping your back leg. The first variation was keeping the back thigh bone straight and solid while your pelvis moved forward. Second variation was flipping that around and moving, keeping your pelvis as it was and letting your leg move back. Now, if you like this and you want to see how that looks inside of an actual yoga practice, we've got lots of different hip lunging, wonderful hip extension classes in the Heart and Bones online yoga studio. So go to www.heartandbonesyoga.com, sign up, join the membership for all sorts of unlimited yoga classes that your body will love. So I hope you join up. Press that subscribe button here, share this video with everybody that you like and love and who will appreciate this very wonderful movement education. Stay tuned for the next video on hip extension.